took me
All right. So anyway, I'll go. So I wanted to kind of hit on trickle down economics a little bit. So we've talked about this in he sits back, he's like, fuck. Oh god.
Oh no.
That timing was perfect.
Please go look at the messages I just sent you. Our cat is being hilarious.
Oh yeah. So we've hit on this a little bit here and there. Mostly me and Nathan kind of getting into it in passing, and never really talked about it. So I thought I'd bring up some data and just some information on why I really think it doesn't work. I thought we could get into a little bit of topic and talk on that. So I'll start with this one. And sorry that the graphs they're not super clear. I couldn't find a good picture of what I wanted to show. Most of them were smaller images. But anyway, so this first one, this particular one shows in purple, it shows the top tax rate. So, back in down here, you can't really read it, but this is 1950s, and this goes all the way through the 2000s. So it's a pretty broad, long time there. The purple line is the top tax rate. So your income tax rate. I think this particular graph is actually corporate tax rate. It's not individual, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And then the blue up and down here is real GDP growth. And so one of the arguments that people make for trickle-down economics is that if you lower the tax rate, either on individuals or corporations, or both, that more money is available into the economy, and we should see a larger GDP growth because of that. And this graph is actually showing that there is no correlation there. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, you can do a correlation curve to this data. And the correlation curve actually, it's like 0.03. And for those that aren't statisticians, like Rudy Giuliani's witnesses.
Yeah, apparently. Sorry, guys. My Republican fan base is fleeing.
So the way correlation curves work is it looks at the data, and basically if something is 100% correlated, if you have a move in one set of data and the other one correlates with it 100%, you get a correlation of either -1 or 1. 1 being they match. So if one raises, the other one raises. -1 being they're the opposite of each other. If one raises, the other one decreases by the same amount.
Yep.
The correlation curve for this is 0.03, meaning it's nearly zero. There's nearly zero correlation between real GDP growth and tax rate.
Top tax rate. But if you were to look at the data, it actually shows it's null. It means nothing. But if you wanted to, it actually would show that by increasing the tax rate, you would increase GDP by 0.03, right? Like correlation rate. So it shows that they're maybe slightly a little there, but right. So question:
it's enough to say that it's negligible.
So you know more about this stuff than me, and obviously I didn't come prepared for
This is just for talking, right? This is
Yep. So do you have a graph that has the effective tax rate as opposed to the top tax rate? Right, because companies weren't all taxed at 90%, right?
No, but tax rate they vary, right? And to your point, yeah, there are other graphs. I'll see if I have another one on here that does effective, and I have several to talk about this. So I think this is no, that's not the right one. Oh, I closed it.
Oh no.
This one. So here's another one that has effective rate on capital income and statutory rate. But this is
Can you zoom in on that at all?
I can do. Man, which one did I close? Son of a monkey.
The most important one, probably. Thank you. That's better.
And so, but as you can kind of see from the graph, but I can tell you from what I was just looking at, there is very little to no correlation. Like the data shows, there's no correlation between tax rates and GDP growth. So that trickle-down economics, at least to the point of triggering, GDP growth doesn't work. And not to get too much on just that, because I have a couple other ones that I wanted to show.
Can I make a point about this?
Well, let me talk about a couple more, and then we can...
Go ahead. Yeah. Yep.
So this one is a similar graph, but it also talks about income growth rate. So, okay, great. GDP doesn't grow, but you know what? People make more money. That's the important thing. That's the one that matters. Is that people get they actually make more money. Their income rate grows. And this is actually showing the opposite again. Similar to the other one, the correlation coefficient for this is nearly 0. It's 0.06, right? So it's showing that there's no evidence that there's any correlation between tax rate, top tax rate, any tax, like tax rate and income. It's not to say that if you lower the taxes that it's going to make a difference either, or raise them. It's just saying there's no correlation. They don't affect each other, right? Tax rate and income are separate things. They don't really relate. Hourly wage growth, similar to income in a way, but a little bit different. If you compare the curves, you can see that they don't really match. So they're not.
So
they're
let me
independent.
just ask you. I mean, you know more about economics than I do. Why do these graphs have top tax rate? Because, and as I again, this is as I understand it, my layman's understanding of tax rates. The top tax rate is not a very good metric at all, because companies aren't or never were taxed at that tax rate. So they were mostly taxed at around something like 35, not 90.
Part of there's a couple caveats there. One is I didn't have a lot of time this week to do deep dives and get all the graphs that I wanted in the way I wanted, right? So like I said, these aren't very clear because I wasn't able to get to the right research papers that I wanted to get to. So the particular ones that I pulled were looking at top tax rate. But why I still think that's relevant is generally you don't have someone come out and say, hey, we're just chopping off the top. Everybody else still pays the same, right? Generally, all the taxes shift downwards to some extent. So I still think top tax rate shows you an effective tax rate in a way. Not necessarily exactly, but I still think that they're relevant. So I think it's still worth the talk, and it still shows the point. But I do give you some credence in saying that, talking about corporate tax rates versus personal income tax rates, and talking about effective and average and how things change do play a factor. But almost every study I've seen that I've ever looked at historically show that there's really no correlation on these. So this is just the particular one that I pulled. In this particular case, hourly wage growth rate, which is one of the big ones, right? The trickle-down economics thing, one of the biggest things is, hey, if you cut corporate tax rates, which is what this is showing, the corporations pay their people more money. So their wage should go up. And interestingly, the correlation coefficient for this one is 0.34, meaning that it's not quite 0, so it's not as far removed as the other one. So there's some correlation here, but it's actually a positive thing in that if you raise their taxes, you increase the wages. And I actually don't think that there is a correlation, and that's what the papers that I've read say. It's just that wage growth was higher. Yeah, it's more of a coincidence thing than anything else. But there's a little bit of that correlation. And then the last one that I wanted to show here is unemployment. So they say, well, unemployment changes, if you have lower tax rates, and the same thing applies. There's no correlation between the top tax rate, or probably the tax rate, which I don't have the data, and unemployment rate. There's no correlation. It doesn't show that one affects the other. And that's the biggest thing to take from these is it's not that, by lowering taxes you make it better. It's that taxes don't affect it. It's not a thing that drives these metrics. And so I guess I'll leave it at that for a second, and we can get your impressions and thoughts, and then I have a couple other ones maybe to counter with that.
What do you think, Chris?
I mean, I'm pretty much in full agreement. I think trickle-down economics is a sham. I think it's definitely just like a way for the rich to stay rich and continue to build up wealth. I think I'm sure, there is obviously a correlation, I would say. I mean, when we look at it like really, really high tax rates, like sure, when we nuke somebody at 70% or above, like of course that's going to affect growth. But
on that graph, I know it was hard to read. On that graph on the left, and I just closed them all so I can't pull them back up, damn it.
That's what I was going to ask you too.
But the one on the left was 90%. So back in the 50s, the corporate tax rate the top rate was 90%.
Wow. Yeah, I mean,
the effective tax rate wasn't like that's not incredibly honest. That's what I'm going to talk about when I get to mine. But effectively, and this is just off my memory, and I could be wrong. And this came from conservatives, so take this with a grain of salt. I think effectively the tax rate was around 35. It wasn't 90. Like with all the loopholes and tax breaks and all that kind of stuff.
At the end of the day, it's just like, for all the talk that conservatives have on like America first, and I'm all here for this. This is our country. We should protect our country. We should like make our great country. To be able to do that, the reality is we need robust, reformed social programs. We should be the best in the world. We should have the best healthcare in the world. We should have the best roads in the world. We should have the best military in the world. To do those things, it requires money. And one of the ways that we receive money is by taxing the wealthy, and by creating jobs, which then in turn produce income tax, which also comes from the wealthy. But at the end of the day, it's like, Jeff Bezos should not be taxed. Capital gains, these types of earnings from stock breaks and from stock expenditures instead of income expenditures, these things should be taxed at a heavier rate. I'm all here for taxing the hell out of the wealthy. That's like something I'm pretty much all here for.
So on a sidebar, just because you mentioned it, do you think that income gains from investments should be taxed less than, equal to, or higher than normal wage earnings, so earned income?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, so I can't like throw out specific numbers because I don't want to be.
That's what your gut feeling. No, just like do you think that if I took $100,000 and I put it into the stock market and it made $100,000 for me this year, that I should pay that should count towards my normal earnings and I should pay my normal income tax on $100,000, or do you think that should be taxed differently than if I would have gone out to a job and made $100,000?
Yeah, I think it should be taxed higher than it currently is. But not to the extent that it's at the, sorry, I'm hiccuping. It should not be taxed at the highest rate possible, because I do think there's something to be said about investments, especially when it comes to retirements. Maybe we can have different tax breaks. I think that's where the tax code needs to be a bit more complex, is when it comes to investments. But it definitely should be like, this 15% type situation.
Gotcha.
I don't know much about that. I don't know what it's taxed at right now, but I'm generally for lower taxes. And I think people investing in companies should be incentivized, so the less taxing, the better.
Yeah. It's taxed at two different rates. It's taxed if you make under a certain amount of money, you pay capital gain. Well, first off, you have short-term and long-term capital gains. Short-term is taxed at your income rate. So just as if you went out and worked a job, long-term is taxed at its own rate. And then long-term capital gains tax has ranges, and it ranges from zero. It basically, if you're a broke ass and you don't have a job and you have no income, you don't pay any capital gains tax, all the way up to 20%. So if you're a wealthier person, and it's not even that wealthy, right? It's not that hard to get to the 20% range. Then you pay 20% on your capital gains. But income tax rate is much higher than 20% for the highest tier. So there's a disparity there.
Okay, so I want to make a couple points. So number one, we have one of the most progressive, from what I've heard, we have one of the most progressive tax policies in the world. Even among the countries that we generally consider socialist, we have a very progressive tax rate where the rich people are paying about 40% of our entire tax base, and it's already more than the people who have those social programs you're talking about. So that's number one, and please fact check me on that. Like seriously, come back at me with some stats. I'm down for it. But
totally believe it. But also keep in mind that we have a massively, massively expensive military, and that's where a lot of those funds go to.
Agreed. Yep. So that was one point. Another point. Again, I'm going to reiterate. I don't. So this is not a point for or against, but the graphs that Tim showed, again, it was top tax rate. And from what I understand, top tax rate is not necessarily something good to go off. You want to know what the companies were effectively taxed at. So for example, back in the 50s, Tim showed us a graph that had the top tax rate being 90%. There was no companies getting taxed at 90%. They all, there was loopholes. There was, whatever there was. Nobody was getting taxed at 90%. From what I understand, from what I remember hearing, it was 35, 40% at most, which is still ridiculous. Say what?
If they were a sucker.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're stupid.
Again, I doubt that. I agree with you. I doubt that most companies are paying those rates, and I think if you had tax rates that high that companies are actually paying, and a lot of times they probably would leave and go somewhere else, especially in today's economy. And back in the 50s, it was not a global economy. Right. It wasn't like you just went to China instead, or you went to somewhere else. So things are different now, and I understand that. And tax rates should, adjust and apply to the situation that we have. And
and I want to piggyback.
My point is more though that, and so let me show this graph just real quick, because this kind of goes on to your argument a little bit.
Yep.
So this is the average federal tax revenue. So this combines corporate and personal income tax as a percent of GDP. So it's not about effective tax rates. It's not about if it's corporate or individual. It's about the total amount percentage-wise of GDP that the federal government is taking from the populace as far as taxes, right? And you can see that ranges from 2.5% to 17.5% over 140 years, 150 years, and the average GDP growth per capita is almost identical.
Right. So, and that actually rolls into my last point, which is ignoring external factors. So just for example, with the graphs that you showed, in the 1950s, the American economy had this wonderful advantage of being the only economy that hadn't been bombed in the Western world. Right. So I think that if those 35%, 40% effective tax rates were lowered down to 20, we would be infinitely richer today than we are now. Right. So my argument is actually that it's not that, because we're looking back at it, like, look how rich we are now. Obviously those 90% top tax rates didn't hurt us, when in reality, it's possible that if those were lower, we actually would have been far wealthier now than we are. But to continue on the theme of external factors, right? So a whole bunch of things are changing, right? And you have to take all of those things into account. And this is where it becomes incredibly complicated. And it's not just statistics, or it is statistics, but you need far more than just, tax rate versus, wages. And it gets very, very, very complicated. But it's like the 50s, the United States was an industrial powerhouse because Europe was bombed out. Then we moved into a global market that depressed the market in some places, that did other things here. There's massive effects for this. Whole industries went under, whole industries rose. Technology is now helping us be more efficient than ever. Like, there's just like a billion things that you can look at, right? And so even the last graph that you showed there, we're saying the government is taking 2% of the GDP back in the 1800s, then it was 10%, then it was 15 or 17%, whatever the numbers were. That doesn't mean that if those numbers weren't lower, that maybe that last tick in the GDP would have been way up if we weren't taxing at 17%. So it's.
I agree with you. The federal government could be saying, "Hey, we only want to maintain about a 2% GDP per year growth, so we're going to tax accordingly." Right? That could be what they're doing secretly behind the table, right? I mean, we can always find reasons to why something's happening, but I think that if you really want to be honest with yourself and take a look at the data, you'll find that overall tax rate doesn't affect all of these economic factors that people are talking about. And I think the big reason why, my gut feeling on this, is because taxes aren't just removing money from the economy. It's not like the government just takes the money and sticks it in their sock drawer, right? They take the money and they buy airplanes, they buy boats, they pay for roads, they pay for other services, they put it back into the economy, they do other things with it. Now, not always efficiently, right? They might buy golden toilet seats, but somebody sold them a golden toilet seat, right? Like, those things are coming from the private sector. So the tax money goes into the public sector, and then
it gets diversified and spent back into the private sector somehow or some way. And it might not be in exactly the same way that it would have happened had the money not been taxed in the first place, but it also could have been that the guy who it got taxed from would have just stuck it in his sock drawer, right? And that's the thing that trickle-down economics makes the assumption on, in my opinion, is that when a person gets so rich, they're like, hey, I'm so rich, let me give more back to other people. And that isn't what happens. Those people that have the drive and the strive to become that wealthy and work that hard, they don't look at it like, now I just want to give it all back. Now they give some back. I mean, you can look at Bill Gates as a great example. He gives a ton of money to charity. But, that's overall, money,
that's not
money. And I'm not saying that we have to take all their money. Like, you should be rewarded for working hard. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have progressive tax rates, or that we shouldn't have some social systems in place that help to take that money and redistribute it, so that, and it actually helps the wealthy, because as GDP, if you can have a higher GDP growth, that wealthy person that owns a business, their business is going to grow faster, and in the long term, they're going to be wealthier. And that's actually what, and I don't have the data pulled up for this discussion. I didn't think I'd have time because we're kind of, doing so many different segments, but that's what the data shows, is that when you do it that way and you put the money back in manually, you don't say, hey, I hope that this guy's going to be charitable enough to just give it away, but you manually take it back and you put it into the system through building up, road systems, other things through the government, or social systems. Like, this is when I got really interested in this stuff, was looking at Andrew Yang's discussions on mind blanked. Well, when he was going to give everybody a monthly stipend, basically.
Yeah, universal UBI.
Universal basic income. Thank you. That's when I really got interested in looking into this. That actually is a great way of taking the money, putting it back into the system, and getting it spent. If me or you get an extra $1,000 a month, we're going to spend it. If Jeff Bezos gets an extra $1,000 a month, it's not going to make a difference, right?
Yeah,
so, and by spending it, it's okay. So that's a whole nother argument, going back to, hey, this is how we wrote something 200 years ago, we should never change it. That's a whole different discussion we can have. But the point on just trickle-down economics being that the thought is, give all the money to the people at the top, and they're going to give it down to the people at the bottom. That just doesn't work, and that's what most of the data shows. That was my point.
Yeah. Totally. I think there's definitely the mentality that trickle-down economics means that wealthier people are going to continue to invest, continue to grow, continue to hire more people. But quite honestly, that's not what happens. I mean, relatively anecdotally, literally just a couple of weeks ago, my friend, are ready for a horror story that really backs up Tim's point in the mentality of trickle-down economics. I have a really good friend who is Ivy League educated, makes a ton of money doing analytics in New York for an ad agency. They've actually boomed under COVID because they happen to work in the pharmaceutical industry, and so they're making advertisements or things that people like. Now all of a sudden everyone wants to get vaccinated for everything as a phenomenon of COVID, right? So their business is booming, right? And then the other clients are tech sector, which I don't need to explain why that's booming. Recently, even though the company has had incredible growth, all-time high growth, instead of, now keep in mind, he's at relatively high up. So the one step below him, most people at that level, being a senior analyst and junior analysts and entry-level analysts, all require prestigious degrees or experience. The company decided to fire and lay off every single person below the manager level. So all senior analysts, all junior analysts, all entry-level analysts. This is a $1 billion company with thousands of employees. Instead of reinvesting and hiring more people, they fired everybody and now outsourced all those jobs to India.
So is your argument against globalization, or what's your argument for?
I think his argument is that Trump's tax cuts didn't give them more jobs.
Right. The argument is that the wealthier a person is, the wealthier an industry is, does not mean that they're going to invest those dollars back into more employees. It does not mean they're going to invest those dollars into
they invested it into employees. Those employees just live somewhere else
with way less pay.
Yeah, so that's right, because that's worth it to them. That's capitalism. They work for that wage because in their country that is worth it for them. They get a return, and so in return, whatever service they provide is now cheaper for their customer, and more capital is freed up to reinvest into the economy.
Yeah, but those jobs should have stayed here.
I'm sure they didn't just straight up call all their customers and say, "Hey, we're lowering our price by 10% because we just outsourced."
How do you know?
No, because I've worked for companies that outsource stuff. You keep the price the same, you make more profit.
So let me just say this then, and you guys can say whatever you want. But I think we should get to Chris's spicy hot topic for tonight. But our fundamental disagreement is that you guys come at companies with like a pessimistic Scrooge McDuck attitude, where you're thinking about all the things that could and do go wrong, or the things that you disagree with how they do things. And it's like, if companies make actual mistakes, right? So what you just told me wasn't a mistake. They actually made their company more efficient. It sucks for the people that work there here in this country. And there's some arguments to be made for protective, like globalism versus, nationalism. I didn't take either of you for nationalists, which is kind of weird because you're making nationalist arguments. But these companies go under if they make shitty decisions that you're talking about, right? For example, if they get a tax break and they hoard that money and they don't reinvest it, or they don't hire more people, or they don't expand or renovate the building or get better gear, like if they don't do that, their company will fail to the competitors who do those things, right? So it's kind of like a mindset thing. I don't know, Chris, that sucks for those people. But that company's going to do better now, right? It's more efficient now. And you can talk about a protective thing, again, but I don't think either of you are nationalists. So keeping jobs in the United States, I don't think is on your agenda.
It is on my agenda. Yeah, no, I'm pretty much here for that.
That is kind of a Bernie thing. So
I think a flaw in your logic there, and this applies to what I study a lot too, which is the markets, is that the economy isn't efficient. And what I mean by that is, so if you study markets and investing and stuff, there's two thoughts in the world.
Let's do this. Make your point quick, and then let's go.
I'll do it. One is that the market's efficient, one's it's not. And basically, what that means is that all the information's already out there, and it's going to work the way it's supposed to, right? Like you can't beat the market because everybody already knows everything, and the price is what it's supposed to be. And so you're assuming that capitalism is efficient, and that, if this company doesn't do things perfectly, somebody else is going to do them perfectly, and they're going to overtake that person. But that historically is not what's happened in capitalism. What happens in capitalism is a company gets ahead, and they have the weight and the power to throw around, and they're able to take out their competition and build a monopoly, and then rule a certain sector of the thing. And so there's now been put in place a lot of laws and other things to prevent monopolies and other things like that, right? But the basis of it still applies, that the companies aren't looking to distribute that money to their employees or to their customers or to anybody else. If they can get by and do something and make more money for their pocket, for the shareholders or for the owner of the company, if it's small enough that it's not public or anything like that, that's what they're going to do. That's their goal. It's not saying that they're... And I'm not saying that it's wrong. Hold on. I'm not saying that it's wrong. It does happen that way. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, right? That's why you start a business, is to make money. I'm not saying it's wrong to try and make money. I'm not saying it's wrong to be rich or to be rewarded for the risk that you took and the capital you put in and the time you put in or the luck that you had or anything like that. None of that. All I'm saying is, from an economics perspective, if you're trying to look at total GDP growth for country, what's best for the population, trickle-down economics is not it. It's redistribution to some extent of those earnings back to the population to pump them up and to grow GDP. Before we kick off of this, I wanted to put up data that you hit on, which was this is old. It's 2014, but it is what it is. Income paid by what groups? So you can see that the wealthy do pay a significant chunk of the taxes, but then you get into here where you have the fairly wealthy. They don't pay shit somehow. I'm curious to look into this deeper and see what happens here.
Yeah, look into that. I want to know what. That's weird.
So something I noticed when I was looking at this, our earlier discussion, which we might get to, which was the distribution of people who voted Republican versus Democrat.
Yeah.
This group here is what voted Republican. Remember, it was like as you got more money.
Wait, but that's just.
Or the other way around. I forget. Anyway,
share
it was that price range.
Yeah.
Share of net income tax burden. I'm not sure what the two blue lines are actually, or the two lines are.
Adjusted gross income.
Yeah. Okay,
So the share of the total income of the country, right? So the share of these people make 28% of the total income of the country. So for their income, they pay a higher percentage of
the taxes. All right. So that just looks weird because of the way that this graph is set up, because the intervals.
But if you only look at the red, which is net income tax burden, so of all the taxes paid, they paid 55% of it. This group, the middle class, paid 40% of it. Right? And so the poor obviously are receiving benefits from taxes. They get credits and other things, right? And so
where do you they paid 40? I see they paid 16.
20,
you're adding those together.
30,
gotcha.
40.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wait, you're considering 100,000 to 200,000 as middle class?
I mean, not really. I don't think. I just said it as meaning on this graph.
The middle of the graph.
It's yeah. I mean, it's not middle class. I'd say it's probably 200 plus is maybe the top 20% income range of the country or something.
That's like the rich people. I would consider over 100,000, not rich, but those are well-off people. Well-off people are paying all the taxes. Look at that. That's like 16 to like if you factor in the
if you do over 100,000, if you do over 100,000, you're looking at 79, 80, 85%. People that make over $100,000 pay 85% of the tax burden.
That's progressive enough for me. I mean, it's like middle class is paying 16%. Middle class and below is combined seems to be paying about 15 or 16% of taxes.
Yeah. So I think to compare the two, it's interesting though that until you get to this point, right here's where it kind of breaks. Everybody here is paying a smaller percentage in taxes than they are than their percentage of AGI is equal to. Here, 100 to 200,000, you break even, right? You're paying what you earn, and then as you go higher, you pay more than you earn, and it increases obviously. And this is an interesting group because this 250,000 or more, like the guy that makes $1 billion a year or whatever, skews this graph intensely, right? But the point being, right? So I agree with you that the wealthy or wealthier, the better off, pay the majority of the taxes. And I don't think that our system needs to be much more progressive than this.
I think it's progressive. We just need to work with the money we have.
But I think that, I think on the corporate level, we should pay more attention to making sure that the businesses pay taxes. But that's a whole other topic. Anyway, I'll let you get to yours, Chris. I appreciate all the time and patience.